Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is episode 15, which is going to be our fourth installment of the Evolution of Civilizations, The Rise of Babylon. So, Nima, I'm finally back from Hawaii, and I've had a few minutes to sit down and listen to your recordings while I was gone, and I caught the puppet joke about me interrupting and swearing.
Yeah.
All the time. I'm glad that's the if anybody takes anything away from these podcasts, that's the one thing I want them to take away is Dylan likes to interrupt swearing all the time.
Exactly. Any podcast, basically me working around you interrupting and swearing whenever
Hawaii was awesome. For everybody who hasn't been to Hawaii, it was my first time I've been there. Coming out of the greater Seattle area where it's pissing down rain now that it's November, and going into paradise for the first time in my life was pretty incredible. And I am frantically trying to figure out how I can make money by going back there, which I may have further developments on in the future. But for the sake of time, instead of chatting about Hawaii, I guess we should jump right back into this because I got a lot of notes. And we're getting back, like I said, to the Evolution of Civilizations, which is us reading from Carol Quigley's book, The Evolution of Civilizations, in an effort to apply the scientific method to historical analysis, with the goal of being able to turn history into a practicable subject, not the crap that you remember from high school, where you remembered one name and one date after another, wondering, how am I ever going to use this in my life? Now, before we get into this, I have repeatedly spoken about the outdatedness of this material, being as this book, Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations, is going on 60 years old now. And since Nima and I have started this miniseries on the Evolution of Civilizations, I've been spending more time on YouTube looking for and listening to information and entertaining channels on history. And one of the big ones I found is the Kings and Generals channel, which is hosted by the Teaching Company on YouTube. Totally go check it out. Most of their videos are on famous battles in history, and they do an incredible job with their animations and showing specific geography about, what exactly is being fought over and who won what. And for someone, I guess, who's a more visual learner like me, it really helps make the story more graspable to understand when I could see things moving around on the map. The other one I have to mention is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Nima, are you familiar with that one?
I heard about it, but I don't think I've ever listened to it.
Oh my god, it's awesome. One of the things that Dan does is he takes, some part of history that he's interested in, and he obviously makes a podcast out of it, but one of the things he's really able to do is turn it into a dramatic story while simultaneously teaching you history. Listening to his podcast, at least for me, is akin to watching a really good movie. And again, it makes the subjects more relatable and memorable. So, due to me doing this, I've had some newer stuff popping up on my YouTube feed. And one of them was a Joe Rogan podcast with a pair of guys named Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. Have you heard of these names?
I have not.
Okay. A friend had mentioned to me in passing a couple months ago, and I kind of didn't really think too much about it. The hook on the title of the show was something like the Earth radically changed 12,000 years ago. And I click on this and I get into it, and the topic is about Graham and Randall talking to Joe about some insanely cataclysmic event that changed the Earth 2 times, 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. And the information that they were going over was so powerful and so paradigm changing in terms of history that we may have to throw out in almost everything we talked about in part 3, being the early matrix of civilizations, or the how people were moving about before civilization started. And so part 3, we talked about this, after Eurasian landmass, it kind of gets split into 2 parts because there's this flat land to the north and the flat land to the south, and it kind of gets cut in half by this huge mountain range from the Pyrenees to the Himalayas, and how these, grinding ice ages back and forth kind of push and pulled people to mix and get isolated, and they ended up in certain spots where we got these people of the highlands, the ones kind of hanging out in the mountains, are the ones that ended up developing agriculture, and the one compared to the people on the flatlands who are kind of these pastoral, warlike peoples. And this kind of sets the stage for the first civilization, which is Mesopotamia, which we're still going to be going into. But
first documented civilization.
But this whole story that we've been telling, like that there was this million years of ice ages coming and going, and people have been around roughly the same amount of time, as far as we know. What is it that happened about the last ice age, that the last ice age melts away, and then it's like, bam, go Sumerians, go Egyptians, go Harappa civilization, go Chinese civilization? Like, for some reason, this last ice age was like when civilization flowers up. And I mentioned in a previous episode in this miniseries, I don't remember which one, like, we're still discovering megalithic structures like underwater. Like there's some massive pyramid underwater near Okinawa. And one of the things that they went over in this Joe Rogan podcast, there's actually a archaeological site in I think central southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
First time I heard of it as well. It was discovered in the early 90s, and I think it was dated back to like Roman times originally, but the redating has put it back 8 to 10,000 years ago, which puts it a square at least 2,000 years prior to like the earliest, vaguest signs of Mesopotamian civilization.
And that is which civilization?
We don't know.
Oh.
That's what we're getting into here.
Wow.
So the story now, shifting to what this Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson were talking about, is that they're making the argument that the last ice age didn't gradually melt, but it was either abruptly ended by a comet or a series of comets that smashed into the glaciers and pretty much vaporized them instantly. And also unleashed dams of water that were held back by glacial ice sheets, which caused 2 major things to happen. The first one was apparently most of the Ice Age was across North America. For some reason, Siberia was warm at the time. Go figure that one out. Randall Carlson didn't have the answer to that one either, but they had we got an idea of the maps of what the Ice Age looked like, roughly 12,000 years ago. That the amount of water that was unleashed on the North American continent caused a 1,000-foot tsunami. I can't even grasp that. A 1,000-foot tsunami, and they get into the evidence where they start looking at the landscape of North America. Particularly, they looked a lot at Washington, where if you zoom out enough, there's very, very clear indicators in the geology of a 1,000-foot wave. Essentially, there's no other way to put it. and that the impact from these melted glacier rose the sea levels 400 feet around the world. Now, we all know that the sea levels rose when the ice age melted. However, if the ice age melted gradually versus the ice age melting, like, geologically speaking, instantaneously, anybody living on the shores really wouldn't have enough time to get away. Because, like, 400 feet underwater, that's a lot of water. And Randall Carlson points out, which something that we've already pointed out, that the earliest civilizations appeared on river deltas. And river deltas are obviously right next to the ocean, because part of the definition of being a delta is being, where the river finally gets into the ocean. That if you had a place that was next to a river delta, or if you had a city or a civilization or a town or whatever, and you had this 400 feet of water rising in a very, very short amount of time, you'd be underwater. It'd all be underwater. And which, kind of gives me goosebumps when I think about that pyramid underwater found near Okinawa. And they didn't bring this up, but Graham Hancock brought up another one, that there's a megalithic structure found in the Sicilian Channel next to Sicily. That's very clearly a megalith, because the carvings in it, or the drilling, I guess there's some holes drilled in it in the same fashion as the drillings on some of the megalithic structures in Göbekli Tepe, this place in Turkey. And even the mainstream understanding of this, gradual ice age melting places those waters going up minimum 9,000 years ago. So at the very least, that megalithic structure under the water is 9,000 years old. So I've been kind of tripping over the last few days, because I saw this a few days ago, because I've heard of stuff like this in the past, and it's almost always just laden with conspiracy, in the propagandistic term of the word, which is just people, conspiracy theory of people just wildly making stuff up. You bring in the aliens, and you bring in that the Illuminati go back that far, and you bring in, there's special dimensions that they were accessing to have special technology to be able to do this stuff, and there's a civilization that went back, whatever, and all this stuff gets mixed together. You can't separate one from the other. And honestly, I was reading this sort of stuff 13 years ago. I just gave up. I'm like, I can't tell what's up from down. Forget it. I'm gonna stick to stuff like Carol Quigley, where I could be like, okay, this guy was a professor who is taking the official story and at least doing something productive with it. But the link for this is going to be below in the show notes, the Joe Rogan podcast. The amount of evidence that these two guys go over for the hypothesis that there was civilization prior to the last ice age. We don't know how far back. And that the majority of it was lost because, first of all, if there was anything on North America, it's gone now because a 1,000-foot tsunami takes out anything and everything. And two, if river deltas were the natural place to have a civilization and the water level rose 400 feet, obviously whatever river delta is that they had built along is now 400 feet under the water. So, I'm kind of tripping on this, Nima. You're being kind of quiet over there. You got any commentary?
Well, no, because I've been telling you on our past shows that I believe that human civilization is probably tens of thousands, if not millions of years old. I mean, I don't know. So, but then we can only go by what we have documented and what we have evidence for. So what we have documentation for is obviously Sumerians, and then the following civilizations. But I thought we were in agreement that civilization is probably much older than that.
I think I was in agreement before because honestly, I just want it to be true because it's cool. I'm a sci-fi guy, right?
Okay.
I mean, and
Mhm.
there's something that Randall and Graham pointed out, which is what we pointed out too, which like this thing under Okinawa I mentioned, and there's some other megalithic structures that have been found, and there's actually a lot of different things in the mainstream story that don't really fit in the mainstream story. And apparently, for example, the Sphinx is one of them. And even though I suspected that, this is the first time I have had my face slapped with the evidence so hard I'm still not seeing straight.
Yeah.
And when they talked about the reaction that the mainstream historians and I think we should say the institutionalized historians have had to this, it's so obvious that they're defending a position emotionally, where they ignore the evidence. Both of these guys have been invited to debates where the point of the debate was just simply to make a fool out of them. I guess Graham Hancock, I think I'm remembering this right, went on a debate with like Egypt's top Egyptologist that lasted about 30 seconds because the guy went up there and got so frustrated and was like, "Oh, this guy's a pseudoscientist. I can't talk to him," and he just walked off stage. Because that's how you make an argument. And
Science,
bro. I said it before, so now it's the way it is. Which, Quigley specifically points this out, is that, we never actually arrive at the truth with science. Science is not a body of knowledge. It's a method that constantly gets tested and retested. Go ahead.
Except for people today who use the word science as a cover for their religion. Which is religion.
Correct. Which is what this guy was, which is apparently what the guys that are challenging him are doing.
Yeah, establishment science is just another religion.
Thank you. That's the word I wanted.
It's the most powerful,
establishment
most dangerous religion at the moment, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and I think the history of science is filled with this. I haven't read the book, but I've heard of it. I've heard several people reference it. I can't remember the name, but it's a history of scientists and scientific ideas, and there appears to be this generational gap where every single generation of scientists seems to get hooked on their pet ideas, and those pet ideas don't die until they do, and the new generation can come up and throw them out. And I think that's exactly what these guys are describing when they're coming on the Joe Rogan podcast. Or the Joe Rogan Experience, I guess is the name of it, to talk about this. So yeah, we definitely were in agreement that I thought there was prior civilization, but again, to see the facts like this, to see the evidence like this, and to see a concrete hypothesis put together.
Right. No, I mean, another thing that's Alan Watt talks about this on his podcast, Cutting Through the Matrix, a lot, which is that the Sumerian civilization, the mainstream account, just suddenly pops up out of nowhere. Suddenly they have temples, they have hierarchies, they have systems, they have money, they have governments, they have markets. It's completely implausible, right? That would just happen out of nowhere. And then he also says that there are Indian Vedas, which suggest that civilization is probably, that there have been numerous ages before this age, and how long an age is, well, we don't know, but according to speculations, it could be tens of thousands of years, could be 100,000 years. So in other words, it's possible that according to those old Vedas, civilization is a million years or so old.
Well, and then to back that up, and we're going to be getting into the Epic of Gilgamesh here soon, because we're going to talk about Mesopotamia. I reread it for this show. That the story of the flood in the Bible, which is the single ubiquitous story of all mythologies all around the world, that there was this flood that destroyed most people on Earth, and like one guy was able to survive, which kept on the species. That if there was, particularly in North America, this massive tsunami and rains throughout the world that rose the sea level 400 feet, the story of the flood might not be just some weird creation myth.
Of course, yeah. No, I mean, floods probably happened all over the place all the time. So
Well, and specifically this one, where I mean, if you had comets, and then in addition to the comets, Joe Rogan has had another guy on, Robert Schoch, who was more recently, who is making the argument that it wasn't comets that melted the glaciers; it was actually massive solar activity. And there will be a link to this one below. I am just giddy over the fact that
can't be, Dylan, because the sun doesn't cause any warming, according to
shit.
science.
I forgot.
Yeah, 97% of scientists agree. Did you forget about that?
97% of scientists agree that breathing will destroy the Earth. I got that right? Okay. And then actually, a flood would actually be the best thing for the Earth because that would stop the most of us from breathing. And that's good, right?
Of course, because we're the enemy of the world. So yeah.
Right. Okay, I got that straight. I'm glad we didn't.
Anyone who reads his Club of Rome knows this shit.
Yes, thank you, Al Gore, who is a member of that. But it could have been massive solar activity that melted these things, and as I was about to say, I'm just giddy over the fact that now we have a discussion not over whether or not this happened, but how it happened.
Yeah.
Go watch them both. Come to your own conclusions and look at the evidence. But I think both of them made a very strong case for their their individual reasons for why this catastrophic or cataclysmic event occurred. But I think the evidence for the cataclysmic event is very, very, very strong.
Yeah, in my opinion, the reason why the mainstream, whoever controls the mainstream narrative, doesn't want all that stuff to leak out is so that people don't dig deeper into who's actually creating, who's running the show, who's creating civilizations, and who's behind it all. Because there's the science of controlling and manipulating masses of people is so old, and the people who keep it secret and know about it are so sophisticated and, I mean, dare I say, scientific about this, that if people learned about this, if people knew this, there would be a revolt the next day, or a revolution.
Well, half the people, the other half would bow down to their masters. Yeah, I think.
Probably.
Personal opinion.
I'm being optimistic, I guess.
But there would be enough for a revolt. That's true. Yeah, it's I want to hit it again because when we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, you mentioned that why did the Sumerian civilization just pop up out of nowhere with markets and money and government and hierarchy and and that the Vedas refer to that some civilization in a past age. Well, I'll just say this: the Epic of Gilgamesh literally refers to civilization prior to the flood. So, keeping that on hold, I cursorily glanced over this because I still want to get into Mesopotamia. And, the question becomes, if this stuff is true, and it's so contradictory to the mainstream story, and the mainstream story, I think, is what we described in the last episode of this miniseries, what, Carol Quigley went over. I think he had a better view of that mainstream story, but I think it was the mainstream story nonetheless. If this completely destroys the mainstream story that Quigley presented in this book, is it worth continuing going through this book? And I think the answer is yes. Because what we're going through, we're not focusing on individual facts and observations. What we're focusing on is the understanding, the application of the scientific method to any facts and observations that we have. And if there was civilization prior to Mesopotamia, or prior to the Ice Age, whatever, would it still follow Quigley's 7 stages of civilization based on the understanding of the instrument of expansion? I think
I
yes.
mean, what does it matter to Sumerian and post-Sumerian civilization that there were civilizations before? What does it matter to those observations?
Yeah, I agree. So, what I want to do is I'm going to go forward, or we're going to go forward with Mesopotamia as it's described in Quigley's book here, The Evolution of Civilizations, and I guess we'll be able to poke some new stuff in that we can based on some of this new stuff that we've learned. And quick fun fact, I just wanted to throw this out there. When Nima and I were coming up for the name of the show, Amagi, one of the items on the board was the drunken Sumerian half-kings. Nima's half Iranian, which is what made me think of it in the first place, and so I just misappropriated the culture and applied it to myself. But one of the reasons I'm so excited about Mesopotamia is because it had a lot to do with the naming of the show in the first place. So, Nima, before we dive back into Quigley, did you want to say anything more about the cataclysmic event that changes everything that we ever thought about human civilization?
No. Yeah.
Cool. So, quick recap. Civilization, defined by Quigley, goes through a growth and decay process based on its relationship to its instrument of expansion. And an instrument of expansion consists of 3 parts, which is the creation of surplus, the accumulation of surplus, and the investment of that surplus into invention, which improves step 1 and keeps it going forever. Nima did a great episode while I was gone in Hawaii, episode 13, relating this topic to modern money systems. Go check that out if you haven't already. And now, the fundamental historic principle that Quigley is laying out here is that all instruments will eventually become institutions. So an instrument is any societal organization that exists to accomplish a specific goal. For example, an army exists to protect a nation. A school exists to teach children. However, these organizations become institutionalized when they become self-serving, and the original goal of the organization becomes secondary or even often contradictory to the current functioning of the organization. So, for the example of the school, originally a school was supposed to teach children. Now it's there to make sure that the children don't do anything but learn. It's there to do the opposite. So the instrument of expansion follows this same process. And a civilization's relationship to its instrument of expansion is how it grows and dies. And Quigley breaks this cycle into 7 stages. So, and we went over this specifically, I believe, in episode 2, but here's a quick recap. 7 stages are: 1, mixture. 2 or more cultures mix in a way that gives rise to a new society that happens to develop an instrument of expansion. Step 2 is called gestation, where the instrument of expansion, in quotes, incubates, getting ready for actual expansion of the civilization, which of course is stage 3, expansion. The civilization grows into new areas geographically. The standard of living increases, scientific development increases, democracy increases, wealth generally increases, factual knowledge increases, and most importantly, people become adjusted to the expansion, to the growing amount of wealth. Stage 4, which is conflict, is when we start to see that the instrument of expansion breaks down and is becoming institutionalized. So the rate of expansion, this is evidenced by the rate of expansion declining, class conflicts increasing, imperialist wars increasing, and irrationality amongst the population increasing. Essentially, these things, particularly the imperialist wars and the irrationality and the class conflicts, are ways that people who have adjusted to deal with expansion are dealing with the expansion no longer being there. because their societal expectations are not being met. According to Quigley, at this point, once we're in the age of conflict, it is still possible to reform the instrument of expansion and return to stage 3. Now, if the instrument of expansion is not reformed, we go to stage 5, which is called the Universal Empire, which, through the imperialist wars that the civilization has begun in the age of conflict, one political unit conquers the whole civilization, which it was usually on the periphery of the civilization, and therefore still in the most stage 3, because it's the newest of the kids of that civilization. This often creates what historians mistake as a golden age, simply because the fighting stops, the universal warfare stops, and trade can move easier within this now singular political unit. However, because the instrument of expansion hasn't been reformed, the civilization continues to decline, and the people become more rational, which leads us into stage 6, which is decay, where the growing decline and irrationality of the civilization becomes apparent to the point where a society is no longer able to defend itself because it is no longer willing to defend itself. Theoretically, this state can go on indefinitely until a younger and more vigorous society invades it, which of course is stage 7, invasion. Invaders come in from an outside civilization or an outside society and destroy it, and because the civilization has decayed so much, people largely see no reason to defend it, and it stays dead. And unlike invasions in previous stages, for example, if a civilization gets invaded in stage 3 or stage 4, they never seem to die. The one exception to this seems to be Hittite civilization. And when a civilization does die through invasion, this sets the stage for mixture, because now you have the people from the old civilization and the people from the invading society mixing to set the stage for stage 1, mixture for new civilization. Now, our goal is to apply this life and death cycle to actual civilizations, and we're particularly interested in the precursors to Western civilization, which is us, the one we live in now. And these are Mesopotamian civilization, Canaanite civilization, Minoan civilization, classical civilization, think Greeks and Romans for classical civilization. And through several episodes, we're going to be going over these. Obviously, we're going through Mesopotamia right now. And the reason we want to do this is, first of all, it's important to understand our ancestor civilizations, just as it's important to understand maybe civilizations that came before that, because it gives us the basis on which our current civilization is derived. Second, understanding these patterns of our ancestor civilizations are really going to illuminate the contrast between them and when we get to the West, because the West is the most special case of them all, because it does not directly follow the 7-stage cycle that Quigley pointed out. And third, through the understanding of these first 2 points,
does it not follow the cycle at all, or does it just skip back to step 3?
It skips back. It doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 like all the rest of them did.
Right, but so still the cycle still applies, as you explained it earlier. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that correction. The third point is that through the understanding of these first 2 points, we want to be able to interpret the current state of civilization, like what we're in right now, both for the rest and the rest of the world. The questions we want to ask are things like, where do we currently stand in the 7-stage cycle? What are our modern instruments of expansion? What are the potential workable solutions to modern day issues? Or at the very least, what are the right conversations to be having to address these modern day issues? And, I think this is another important one. Do modern day civilizations follow the same rules as the old ones? We're going to have a lot of fun talking about that when we get to that episode. I'm pretty excited for that one. So, Mesopotamia. In part 3 of this miniseries, which is the thing that we're probably going to have to throw out when we start applying some of this newer information. By the way, I sent Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson both an email to come on the show. So
Nice.
if anybody else wants to send him an email saying that they should come on the show, they should, because I really want to talk to those guys, because I think this information that Quigley puts out would be really powerful mixed with what they're presenting. But back to the mainstream story. We spoke of a Neolithic garden culture that lived in the highlands that were apparently the first people to develop agriculture, which was a type of shifting cultivation. So they also were the first people, theoretically, to come up with metallurgy, and they developed hoes that could till the soil, mostly in the foothills near mountains. Their hoes couldn't handle the rough sod of the flatlands. And because they didn't understand fertilization, they would garden or farm a certain area for a couple years and then have to move on because they depleted the soil. Now, eventually, these people wound up in the alluvial river deltas near the sea, and here the yearly floods replenished the fertility of the soil, which provided the basis for the first permanent human civilizations, at least, as we just talked about, post-Ice Age. So, the flood that made the valley fertile also made it dangerous. We're talking specifically about Mesopotamia here, which is between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. And apparently, of some of the other YouTube videos I've looked around at, this one is particularly dangerous. I guess it's not nearly as dangerous as the Nile, because the delta is so much wider. When the flood comes, it comes in very predictable spots. And I guess this is something that's hard for us to imagine, that, and it's something we take as self-evident, but the peasant culture living at the time had no idea of calendars or a method of keeping track of time, so they knew nothing of the movement of the earth and the relationship of the position of the sun and the stars to the seasons, and, Quigley points out, mostly they would never have imagined that the position of the sun had anything to do with the floods. Now, Quigley points out that this is born in the archaeological record. Again, I'd like a modern-day archaeologist to comment on this sort of thing, is that there's evidence of human residences below and above layers of flood-deposited clay. Now, Quigley says, we have no idea how the early Neolithic cultures dealt with this problem. Perhaps they built their residences up on higher areas less likely to flood, while their fields were down in the floodplains. In addition to the flood, another equally huge problem was irrigation, because obviously Iraq is a hot area. It's kind of a feast or famine sort of situation when it comes to water, where when you have it, it's too much, and when you don't have it, it's not enough. So irrigation was a huge issue for farming when there wasn't enough water in the rain for the season. And of course, what was needed for these irrigation projects was knowledge and capital. And at the time, no single individual or family had the resources available to do this. So the situation probably existed for a long time. And the dates for this initial mixture start at somewhere between 6,000 and 5,000 BC. And this is, Quigley says, is that a social organization arose that was capable of accumulating an economic surplus and able to direct its resources to the productive projects like irrigation. And by 3000 BC, in each Mesopotamian city-state, this economic surplus was in the hands of the Sumerian Priesthood. So the priests levied taxes and demanded tribute, usually in kind and on the crops the peasants were growing. And as me and Nima have discussed in earlier podcasts, we know this was done through an advanced money system. And the Sumerian priests were so obsessed with payments and taxes that most of the writing and cuneiform clay tablets that we have passed down through the millennia are actually just like tax records, like who paid who.
Also, just to add to that, Alan Watt mentions that there was some kind of clay inscription uncovered where some regular commoner comments on, he looks from one horizon to the other and all he sees is government buildings and bureaucrats. His income is consumed by tax payments, etc. So yeah, just to add to that.
Wow. It's like we had nothing in common with these people.
So much has changed today, hasn't it?
Yeah, so much has changed. Uh, so quick side note, I wanted to tie back to something you said at the beginning. So the Sumerian priesthood. Um, Actually, no. Let me explain the story that Quigley gives, and I want to get back to that. So from the evidence that Quigley points out, we could probably infer the following. This is the inference per Quigley. Some individual, family, or group of families may have began to notice the pattern of the sun's movement throughout the year, or possibly the movement of the stars, and that this was the first rudimentary idea of the solar year. And with this knowledge, it would have been observable that the floods, came roughly at the same time every year. So this information would have been kept secret, being used by this closed group for their own purposes. They could have claimed relationship to the gods or magical powers and their ability to predict the floods. And even if it weren't initially believed, all it would take would be one lucky guess to make believers out of their neighbors. Thus, this newly founded priesthood could demand tribute and taxes in exchange for the life-saving knowledge of the timing of the floods. And if any small number of peasants contributed to this, meaning you wouldn't need all the peasants, just a few, it would be enough for the priesthood to start accumulating a surplus. And this surplus could be used for things such as flood protection embankments and irrigation ditches, and would be the concrete evidence that we need that that the people would need that it's worthwhile to belong to the organization. So this is the instrument of expansion of the Mesopotamian civilization, the Sumerian priesthood. They levied taxes on the population and were able to get a surplus, which they were able to spend on what more or less were government projects, public sector projects. Now, what I wanted to connect with what you were saying before, particularly what you've been saying about what you just said about Alan Watt, is that suddenly Mesopotamia shoots up out of nowhere. And as you pointed out, there's this commenter writing about the fact that he can't see, all he can see is government buildings from horizon to horizon. It seems very strange that this popped up out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And it may have been that the secret of controlling people could have been passed down from a prior civilization.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Elmwood talks about, the so-called troglodytes, who were mountain or cave dwellers who lived in the caves to be able to survive some catastrophe, and then came back into civilization and mixed with the commoners and started introducing secret methods that have existed for a long time in order to control people. And that would be the knowledge of money, or what you said earlier, maybe the knowledge of how the stars move and how they impact the weather. Then through that, the ability to tax people, but just basically being able to know that this modus operandi, or understanding this modus operandi, and introducing it back into the civilization that you're infiltrating in order to control it ultimately.
So I'm happy you brought up caves. So in the Robert Schoch interview, who argues that it wasn't comets that melted the ice, it was a solar flare is not even the word he used. He used a different term as just like massive solar activity. That if you do the math on this, and I literally mean the math in physics, because we have no modern way of we haven't seen a solar flare like this in any sort of modern times, or any of us could have observed it, but that the solar flare would have caused lightning storms around the entire Earth, just like constant lightning storms everywhere. And it would have created a type of aurora borealis that I'm not making this up. The guy has the physics computation slides on the Joe Rogan podcast. Go look it up. That the aurora borealis shapes in the sky roughly look like stick figures with their hands raised. And that the earliest cave paintings that we're aware of and it's the same throughout all the world, are stick figures with their hands raised.
Mm.
And that the radiation from this solar activity would have fried you unless he could have hid in a cave.
There you go.
And Göbekli Tepe, which we mentioned prior in southern Anatolia, I believe I heard it right, is actually just north of the heads of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Whereas Mesopotamia civilization just happened to be at the deltas of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, that's not proof of anything, but that is, I think that's enough of a story to warrant further investigation. And here's more. Wait, there's more. If you track linguistic history, there's a way of doing this where you can I don't even know how to explain it. Essentially, you can track linguistic history. This is how a big way that people have figured out how people movements have occurred through history and even prehistory. That if you track the Proto-Indo-European language back far enough, it's this spot, you get to this spot in the middle of Turkey, modern day Turkey, which is where the original expansion of the Proto-Indo-Europeans come from. I guess they went around like to the Kyrgyz steppes and up through the steppe in Russia and down into Europe. That there's this spot in central Turkey that is just like riddled with caves, both natural and man-made, that would have been a very easy place for people to run and hide because all the caves were already there, and that the Proto-Indo-Europeans came from roughly that spot if you look at linguistic history or linguistic calculations. Cool. So
Well,
I have about that.
Alan Watt also talks about some big mountain area in Armenia where these people could have come from, but I don't know where exactly. But I wonder if, because Armenia is close to Turkey, obviously, so I wonder if that's the same.
Yeah. And of course, when it comes to dating this sort of stuff, it's hard. But dating wasn't the right word. When you're doing linguistic calculations like this and say, okay, these people came from roughly here, I mean, I think it's a pretty rough thing to say when it's like 10,000 years ago. And then, Turkey is mostly mountains anyway, so probably more caves up in Armenia. Okay. Stage 1 of Mesopotamia. So Quigley dates the Mesopotamian period of mixture at roughly 6,000 to 5,000 BC. Going back to the mainstream story here. There appear to be 3 main peoples mixing to make up this mixture stage of Mesopotamia. The first, the ones we keep talking about, are these Neolithic garden cultures from the Highland Zone. The evidence supporting this are painted pottery, highland herd animals, a duodecimal system, which is a 12-based counting system, and obviously agriculture, that was the big thing, and female earth deities. The second group of people appear to be Semites from the Fertile Crescent, which is in, I think it stretches from Egypt up through Syria, across the Syrian saddle, and down into, I guess, the end at the bottom of the Tigris and Euphrates. And the evidence appears to be a decimal system, which is a 10-based counting system, and male lunar deities. And then there's a third, maybe, and again, it would be great to get a modern archaeologist on the show, because I'm sure they would have a lot more to say about this information at 60 years old. A tropical forest people from the southeast, I guess possibly India, the evidence being the presence of the dugout canoe, tropical plants like the date palm, and a vagissimal system, which is a 20-based counting system. Now, Quigley's reasoning for attributing these peoples to the mixture stage of Mesopotamia is that he's saying at that time, and this, I keep repeating myself, I want a modern update, that there was no archaeological evidence of human habitation prior to the Neolithic garden cultures in the lower valley of Mesopotamia. None have been found as of 1961. The further evidence of mixture, he points out, is actually religious confusion. So I mentioned that the Neolithic garden cultures were actually very focused on female earth goddesses because if they're gardening and their food is from the earth, gardening obviously is a big deal. And because men's jobs were to hunt or do nothing, females actually had a much higher role in society because they produced children and they were the ones working in the farms, which was the most important part of society. So the Semites, their more important deities were male because they were a very patriarchal and warlike society. Obviously, if you're warlike, it's going to elevate the importance of men. And lunar gods that were more important. I mean, we know this simply from the history of Islam. Lunar gods were more important because apparently the moon is more useful to you if you're herding animals. And particularly if you're hunting, changes in the moon are easier to observe than changes in the sun. And it's also easier to keep time by the moon, obviously, because you could see the changes in it more clearly. And so you end up with male lunar deities as your main deities, and obviously the sun would be their consort, so you get kind of this lesser female solar goddess. So as the Neolithic people settled in the alluvial valleys and the social structures became more advanced, males became more significant. I'm still on the religious Confucian thing, just to let you know. Males became more significant in social, economic, and political life, and so the sun also became more significant to economic activities. This reduced the role of the earth goddess and pushed the male solar deity to primary significance. And to confuse matters more, the Semites often represented their lunar deity, often known as Sin, as a crescent, but sometimes as a disk, and a disk could naturally be considered a sun. So, couple this confusion with the increasing importance of the sun in the mixing culture and the chaotic religious matters in Mesopotamia, have an explanation, and Quigley emphasizes that this is actually evidence of cultural mixture, not an inability to think clearly. So, stage 2, gestation. Quigley dates this period from roughly 5,000 to 4,500 BC, and to quote him, since the stage of gestation is by definition a period in which nothing sensational happens, it is not an easy period to discern in the prehistoric evidence. So this is what he says was probably happening during this period of gestation, which is sedentary existence. So people living in the same spot over time would have reduced game because they would have hunted it all out, and thus made hunting of little importance. At the same time, the care of domestic animals would have increased. So as long as society remained a hoe culture, farming would have been mainly a female activity. Thus, men who previously hunted would be able to spend their time caring for domestic animals. Dairying gained huge significance and eventually gained religious overtones, and thus the social superiority of women was reduced. So the rise in the position of men was also increased by the appearance of the Sumerian Priesthood, which was most dominantly a masculine organization. And to quote Quigley, since idly looking at the heavenly bodies or speculating on the relationships between their movements and the earthly events is not something busy females would likely do. It would be much more likely to be found among watchers of herds than among those whose eyes are directed downward in the daylight hoeing the soil. So the care of these domestic animals would also have increased the importance of males because mating and breeding would have made it readily recognizable that the male is very important in the herd, because you need that to obviously fertilize your females. And you can start being selective about what male was mating with the females to create the next stock of animals. What also developed was that death was an essential preliminary to resurrection, both for men and crops. Reproduction of humans through sex and crops through planting were two of the same aspects of fertility and virility. And apparently there were artifacts from the time, there were artifacts which dominated at the time with symbolism expressing this. And quickly went through all sorts of these, and I'm not going to go through them all. And he also goes through the diffusion of ideas that led to these, various religious deities that we're familiar with today. I mean, he gets into the connections of like Zeus and Ishtar and Ramses and Osiris and all these different mythological traditions from all these different civilizations and all these different cultures. You could really draw a very clear, what do I want to call it? Connection between them all, pattern between them all. And to sum it up, we get the idea of an Earth Mother who is given a son, who is also her lover, a heavenly bull, who is associated with the periodicity of the year, and thus with the sun, the burning thing in the sky.
Well, and also the word son, and the word son, the son who's born to a parent, and the sun that's in the sky, they sound alike.
Same word.
Just phonetically.
Yeah. Phonetically the same thing. A note here that we're talking about the bull in Joe Rogan's podcast with Graham and Randall. They bring up the fact that the constellation of Taurus is the one consistent factor in the development of all ancient calendars, including civilizations in the Americas. And they postulate that this may have been a remnant of knowledge from the civilizations prior, and this totally gives me goosebumps that the zodiac, as we understand it today, doesn't just like go back to Mesopotamia. It could be pre-Ice Age stuff that was actually utilized to develop the original calendars.
Right.
So, finishing up gestation here. So these postulated changes during the period of gestation would have been greatly influenced by the development of the Sumerian priesthood. And Quigley states that by 4500 BC, this group would have been a fully established organization that was capable of producing wealth beyond its own immediate consumption, which is what we need to enter the age of expansion. Now, before I talk about the age of expansion, I mentioned I read the Epic of Gilgamesh to get ready for this show. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, if you're not familiar with it, is actually the oldest written story that we know of, and was put together by the remains of cuneiform tablets. And it's essentially an epic poem of similar lines as like the Odyssey or the Iliad, where Gilgamesh was this great king who did these great deeds, and I'll talk about it a little bit. And I actually wanted to bring it up and have a sidestep here, because in all this talk of civilization, we have really skipped over a really, really important part, and that part is food. Food is the most basic requirement for us to even think about civilization, because there has to be an adequate food source to feed the expanding population. And if we view civilization from this angle, we can observe that there's actually only 3 types of people on Earth that make up different civilizations, which are rice peoples, corn peoples, and wheat and barley peoples. So obviously rice peoples are in Eastern Asia, maize peoples were in the Americas, and wheat and barley peoples were in the Mesopotamian and Mediterranean, and we have the West, we're wheat and barley peoples. So not only did these grains provide the basic caloric baseline to keep people alive at a hunter-gatherer society, they have one more incredibly important attribute, which is they can be stored. So what this means for early civilizations when we're talking about the production and accumulation of surplus in the instrument of expansion is we're literally talking about the surplus and accumulation of food, or specifically grain. And because we're talking about Mesopotamia right here, we're specifically saying that the power of the civilization to grow actually comes from the power to accumulate a surplus of wheat and barley. So, going back to Gilgamesh, I'm gonna tie all this together. I took a class in my freshman year of college that I actually absolutely despised at the time, and I wish I took a little more seriously because it was actually a pretty good class. We read things like the Odyssey, Aeschylus, the Aeneid, books from the Bible, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, like I mentioned. And if you're unfamiliar with the story of Gilgamesh, it's a tale of a Sumerian king who's 1/3 man and 2/3 divine, that engages in epic battles with monsters and eventually has to go into the underworld to find a friend that he makes early in the epic, Enkidu. Now, it's worth mentioning, bringing this back to the first part of our conversation today, that the Epic of Gilgamesh also recounts the flood. And in fact, the opening verse of the Epic of Gilgamesh emphasizes Gilgamesh's, in quotes, wisdom because he learned of the time before the flood in his heroic quests by meeting with Utanapishtim. And Utanapishtim appears to be kind of the Mesopotamian version of Noah, as he is the one man that the god Ea warned of the flood to build a boat and survived it. And to quote from the opening narration, full of understanding of all that Gilgamesh had gained, he saw what was secret and revealed what was hidden. He brought back tidings from before the flood. And then a couple lines later, Gilgamesh, reaching his might Utanapishtim, the distant one, restorer of holy places that the deluge destroyed, founder of rights for the teeming peoples, who could be his like for kingly virtue? So
secrecy gave him power.
Secrecy gave him power, and
or knowing the secrets.
Knowing the secrets gave him power, and he restored the holy places destroyed by the flood. Apparently, and there's a note at the bottom that, like, there's a little 2 next to this, and there's 2 at the bottom of the page that says Mesopotamian kings regularly bragged that part of their public works was restoring holy sites and temples that existed prior to the flood. Now, again, the mainstream story just says, "Oh, this is a bunch of creation myth poppycock." But if we look at it with the eyes that we just looked at it here now, this is some pretty impressive stuff. That I mean, this is literally the opening verse, talking about the flood, talking about bringing stuff back from before the flood, these secrets, restoring these holy places that there was places that existed before the flood, and we know that because there was Göbekli Tepe. Yeah, I mean, when we compare it, like what you were saying with Alan Watt was saying, that there may have been the secret people that were hiding out in caves that taught the secrets maybe to the Sumerian priesthood, and eventually, as we'll see, that the kings overshadow the Sumerian priesthood for control over the Sumerian region. It's like we could start seeing these ancient texts, and also like you said about the Vedas, where the Vedas refer back to something prior. What we learned these secrets from these people before us. These might not be such crazy creation myths as they are as an actual record of things.
Right.
Okay, back to Enkidu.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to Enkidu. So, Enkidu was a wild man created by the goddess Araru at the request of all the other gods to be a worthy challenger to Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh was harassing all the young men and women in the city. Presumably, he's challenging all the men to fights and banging all the women. So Aruru makes Enkidu from a pinch of clay and sets him out to live as a wild man.
Sounds like an average Friday night, by the way. Sorry.
I'm trying to think of a Chad meme involving Gilgamesh now.
Well, there's a
somebody make that and send it to us. There's a what?
Well, there's a Chad Haji in the 72 Virgins. Anyone can look that up.
Getting there. Yeah. Okay, so Aruru makes Enkidu from a pinch of clay and sets him to live out as a wild man with the beasts of the steppe. So he's this guy who's almost a wild creature himself. And in order to bring him into the city to meet with Gilgamesh, the harlot Shamhat is sent out to subdue Enkidu with her womanly charms. If you've there's a pretty subpar song, it's a kind of a metally rock song called "The Beast and the Harlot" by, I think it's Avenged Sevenfold. I don't know if they still do. They used to play it all the time on the rock metal station here in Seattle. That's, I'm assuming, where they get this from, "The Beast and the Harlot," which is Enkidu and Shamhat. So I guess sending Shamhat out here to subdue Enkidu with her womanly charms was essentially to get the guy to calm down by having sex with him, because according to the tablets, he flowed into her for 6 days and 7 nights. So he may have had some toxic sperm buildup going on here. So after Enkidu gets calmed down, Shamhat invites him back to the city, where she serves him beer and bread, which is, of course, processed products of wheat and barley, after which Enkidu quickly adapts to civilized life and becomes Gilgamesh's friend after they have this period where they wrestle it out. And back when I read this, when I was 19, freshman year in college, I thought this was the most bizarre idea, that like Shamhat brings him back and the first thing she does is feed him beer and bread. And I've got the verse here. They set bread before him being Enkidu. They set beer before him. He looked uncertainly, then stared. Enkidu did not know to eat bread, nor had he ever learned to drink beer. The harlot made ready to speak, saying to Enkidu, "Eat the bread, Enkidu, the staff of life. Drink the beer, the custom of the land." Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. He drank 7 juglets of the beer. His mood became relaxed. He was singing joyously. He felt lighthearted and his features glowed. He treated his hairy body with water. He anointed himself with oil, turned into a man. He put on clothing, became like a warrior. So, the thing that always had me scratching my head was, why is it the first thing that they do to Enkidu when they bring him back is to give him beer and to give him bread, and that as soon as he eats it, he like takes a bath, puts some clothes on, and gets a job? It's the act of giving him these two things made him civilized. So I thought about this for a long time. Like I said, this was as much as I hated this class at the time, this was like the one part of the class that kept coming back to me every once in a while when I'd be thinking about this, is that if you think about it, what we consider this kind of mundane cuisine, this beer and bread, I mean, if you exclude like microbeers or microbrews, this was the height of technological advancement at the time, turning this grain into this beer and bread. And if you think about it, doing this, it requires production, storage, processing, distribution, and to feed everybody. And particularly with the beer, it also represents a greater level of food safety, because the alcohol in the drink would have served, as a defense against deadly microbes otherwise found in drinking water, and it also serves as a preservative. Thus, the civilizing nature of grains in the form of these, civilized required processes of that grain, turning the grain into beer and bread, it was so evident and taken for granted at the time of the ancient Sumerians that the civilizing effects of these things didn't even require an explanation. It was just understood that if Enkidu ate beer and or ate beer and drank bread, ate bread and drank beer, of course he would be a man, because that's what civilized things do. He couldn't be a beast. Otherwise, how could he eat this? So the Sumerians knew fundamentally that their ability to be civilized rested on their ability to create and accumulate and process grain. Thus, when we're talking about the instrument of expansion for Mesopotamia, it's you got to remember it's all about grain. I guess workers were even paid in grain. And so the ability to save grain was the ability to feed the people, which was the ability to pay them for public projects like irrigation. So, to contrast this to what we talked about in earlier episodes, like 1 and 2, when we started this podcast, we were talking about how the Sumerians utilized a credit money system in order to track and collect taxes. At the end of the day, what mattered was how much grain they were able to collect in order to have.
Well, I mean, I might challenge that and say that to collect and accumulate the grain surplus, they used the money system.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. What I'm saying is, if they had that money system and for some reason they weren't able to accumulate that grain, then the money system wouldn't have mattered. Because they wouldn't have had a physical surplus to feed people to even do the projects. But yeah, I agree. They needed the money system and the tax collection system in order to be able to organize it to begin with.
Well, I think they needed the money system in order to move out of the hand-to-mouth consumption phase and
exactly.
invest, have spending power allocated to people who can drag people out of their hand-to-mouth consumption habits and put them to use in investment projects, essentially.
I completely agree. Totally agree. So that was your Lightspeed shot through the Epic of Gilgamesh and my teenage feelings about it. We'll get back to Quigley's 7 stages of civilization here, where we're going to go to stage 3, the Age of Expansion, which Quigley puts at roughly 4500 to 2500 BC. So a reminder, the signs of an age of expansion are an geographic extension of the society's culture, an increase in population, increase in economic production, growth of factual knowledge, and an increase in science and democracy. So let's see how the Mesopotamians stacked up against this. So, Mesopotamia made some of the most significant advances in human history, or at least that we know of, assuming that these advances weren't in existence prior to some more ancient civilization, but at least as far back as we could track. These things include stuff like the plow, wheel carts, draft animals, bricks, the arch, city life, industrialized production of pottery using potter's wheels, copper and bronze smelting, distant trade, sailboats, writing, an elaborate number system, which most importantly included positional notation, which is required for to be able to calculate with it. Advances in astronomy and medicine, and fundamental changes in social and religious life. And so I think the impact of some of these are worth explaining. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I want to hit a few of them. So the first one is the plow. So obviously a plow is, as opposed to a hoe, a plow allows you to attach something to an animal and you pull it so you can break the soil up in order to plant new crops. This is an obvious effect on the increase of economic production, particularly because it's changing the energy source from human muscle to animal muscle. And the importance of this doesn't sound that great until you realize that animal muscle was the best source of energy there was until people started utilizing chemical energy and the energy of natural forces like windmills or water mills, which is essentially to say nothing better came along until the Industrial Revolution. Maybe minus some medieval windmills and stuff. So, and additional to that, so that, like we were talking about how herd animals were, or domestic animals, led to a shift to importance of males in society. If they're using those herd animals as draft animals, now the farming switches from a female activity to a male activity because the men it was their job to take care of the animals. Again, leading to a more depressed female social status and a more elevated male social status. Pottery, bricks, and the arch are also pretty darn important. First of all, being that Mesopotamia kind of lacks stone and wood. So they figured out how to build things by making mud-fired bricks. And that was another theme of Gilgamesh, again, in the opening verse, that he shows his pride in his city Uruk by saying, "Is it not built of mud kiln brick?" The usage of bricks eventually led to the development of the arch, which would end up being diffused through Syria, Anatolia, and up to Europe by the Romans. And apparently, the arch was only invented once in human history, and I guess the Egyptians never figured it out. And the arch is pretty incredible because it allows for much superior architecture because you can have much, much, much more weight on a smaller amount of stuff. Particularly in comparison, if you're building things at 90-degree angles. Apparently, the reason when you look at old Greek buildings or old Egyptian temples and they've got like a zillion pillars is because if they didn't have a zillion pillars, the ceiling would fall down. Metals and metallurgy. So, according to Quigley, the original metals that were used for tools were from natural nuggets of gold and copper. I guess, obviously, gold was in tools. It was used for jewelry. But possibly from contamination, it was found that a small amount of tin... Oh, excuse me, I skipped a part. Eventually, they were able to smelt metal from ores. So, it's one thing to find a nugget in the earth and, hey, it's already metal and I can use this. It's another thing to say, okay, let's take these blue rocks, stick them in a really hot fire, and then when we're done, we can pull it out and, hey, like, there's these little droplets of copper left over. Blue rock is signifying of copper. There's your chemistry for the episode. So, possibly from contamination, it was found that a small amount of tin or other metals added to copper, A, lowered its melting point, and B, gave it a much stronger alloy. And this is, of course, bronze. Which, of course, is a superior form of science and would naturally lead in the increase of economic production, going back to the signs of Age of Expansion. And by 3000 BC, the correct proportion of tin to copper was figured out, which was 1 to 10. And this is obviously what opens us up to the world of the Bronze Age. And important side note here, and I'll include this video below. In my search for relevant videos about this, I found a lecture by another professor. His name was Eric Klein. Well, he was actually talking about much later, around the 12th century BC, but he was going over the importance of tin in Mesopotamia, not only because it was needed so much, but because there was no tin in Mesopotamia. It came as far as Cornwall from England. And this tells us two things. First of all, that it was so in demand that it needed to travel. It was worth bringing it that far. And second, the only way to do this would be with sailing ships because land travel was much more difficult than sea travel. And one of the things that Aaron Klein postulates or hypothesizes is that tin in the ancient world may have been on a similar level of importance as oil to us today. Like, without tin, you can't make the bronze, and the bronze is what you need to wage war and have tools and grow food and stuff. So, a break or a gap in your tin imports could cause a major catastrophe to your civilization. So moving on to writing and numbers, I don't think we really need to emphasize how important writing and numbers are, but I think it's worth going over a few of their developments because as we get on to later civilizations, we're going to see how these grow. Because it's kind of strange when we look at the Roman numbering system. We're all familiar with Roman numerals. These are actually a step backward from the Mesopotamian system because the Mesopotamian system, like I mentioned, with the positional notation, it allows for calculation. With the Roman system, you can't actually calculate with the numbers like we do today. You can't do like plus minus divide or plus minus divide and multiply with Roman numerals. You have to use something like an abacus to keep track of things. So Quigley points out that most likely due to the Mesopotamians' highly developed sense of private property, they developed writing to keep track of property. And these began as seals imprinted on clay tablets in the 5th millennium. Again, that puts us to 4500 BC, the beginning of our Age of Expansion. And its further development was more than likely driven by the priests' need to track taxes and the temple wealth. So what they ended up developing was cuneiform, which is kind of a clumsy method for coming up with syllables for different words. And at first, these words stood for concrete things like numbers or commodities, but eventually they led to abstract ideas. And, of course, this eventually led to a massive number of symbols to keep track of so many ideas. And for some reason, the Sumerians never figured out how to simplify these ideas, this writing, by creating phonetic symbols, which, again, is also strange because the Egyptians apparently had figured this out, their neighbors, because they had a set of 24 symbols for phonetics. However, they too never really used them because they relied on their hieroglyphics, and it wasn't until the Phoenicians of the Canaanite civilization that we would see this development, which we'll be getting into next week. And for the numbers, even though the Sumerians never figured out 0, which I guess the Mayans and the Indians, or the Harappan civilization, can claim, like I mentioned, they were able to figure out positional notation, which allows for calculations. And originally, they used a base 10 system, which came from the Semitic peoples. But by the historic period, this is so fascinating to me. I'm a math guy. They switched to a base 60 system. And this sounds strange until you realize that 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, which makes it awesome for fractions. And apparently, the ancient Sumerians couldn't figure out fractions that didn't have 1 as their numerator, meaning they could say 1/5, but they didn't know how to say 2/5, or they didn't know how to say 3/4. In order for them to write 3/4, they would have to say 1/2 plus 1/4. So having 60 being your base system, which allows so many of these easy fractions, helps with this. Positional notation was developed by 2100 BC, which I'm sure greatly aided in the calculation of taxes, which is a great increase in factual knowledge and science. And in fact, it reminds me, Nima, do you remember that story? I think it was you who brought it up to me. It's in David Graeber's book about the Sumerian king that calculated the taxes for his neighbor as an excuse to invade.
Yeah. Actually, I was just
it reminded you of that?
It up. Yeah, I was trying to find it actually. I was just looking at the index under compound interest. Well, I don't know, but yeah, there was the first ever documented example of compound or of interest, of any interest, I think, was a Sumerian king who claimed that some other king had been occupying his territory for years upon years, and so he came up with a compound interest that he owed him for the wheat harvest that he lost out on, and ended up being, like trillions of pounds of wheat.
Some impossible number.
Given that some impossible number to pay back. So then that was, of course, a pretext to go to war against them, which, according to Graeber, and that's from the book Debt, the First 5,000 Years from David Graeber. According to Graeber, it was pretty common to just put people in impossible debt in order to justify some sort of military action.
Or slavery.
Or putting people in slavery.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's bring that up right now. We talked about this in the earlier episodes, but debt slavery was a huge issue at this time. Huge issue, and I'm sure it gets worse once we get into the Age of Conflict here. But essentially, if you couldn't pay your debt, not only did you get sold into slavery, your whole family would get sold into slavery. And this would regularly become such huge issues in ancient Mesopotamia. This is where the Jubilee comes from, where you would have this declaration from the king that all debts are cleared. And the implication of that is a little hard for us to grasp, because it's like, oh, well, I guess I won't go bankrupt now. That's kind of our modern thinking. But at the time, that's like, wow, I don't have to sell my daughter as a prostitute. Woohoo! I'm not gonna be rowing a boat under a whip.
Yeah, and like you said, debt crises would actually happen all the time back then, and people would be in debt to the priests, and but they also had practices like if the weather was bad, then your debt would be canceled essentially. If you couldn't produce and you couldn't pay your debt, and you would get another chance.
Okay, moving on to astronomy and the calendar. So, for the Mesopotamian story, astronomy and the calendar is probably the most important development, because it's obviously what the instrument of expansion is based on, which is this priest ability to predict these floods. And whether or not it was an actual development or whether it came from a prior civilization actually doesn't really matter for this. What matters is the priests had the secret knowledge, whether they came up with it by themselves or got it from somebody else. The solar year, obviously, originally became an interest to the Sumerian priesthood as a way to calculate the floods. And quickly makes an interesting point, is that while this sounds scientific, it wasn't in any sense that we would consider scientific today, because scientific implies to us that we would use the knowledge to actually predict something in the future. So, or to predict the movement of the heavenly bodies, and like the relationship with the seasons, or we would really start saying, okay, how do we take this and put it on something else? The Mesopotamians, rather, were, in quotes, empirical, which is they kept a record of the timing of the floods every year and simply took the average of the previous years to calculate the next. And this allowed them to become increasingly accurate in the predictions as the years went by. And remarkably, Babylonian astronomers were able to calculate a solar year. It was one guy in particular, I didn't write down his name, within roughly 4 minutes of the actual solar year. I have no idea how they did this. So Quigley says, and I mean, this must be in some book somewhere, that the Babylonians calculated the year as 365 days, 6 hours, 13 minutes, and 43.4 seconds. I mean, the first fact to me that they're calculating down to the 10th of a second is blowing my mind. But the fact that this is like just around 4 minutes off what we consider a day today is also pretty damn impressive.
Yeah, it shows you that they must have had some previous knowledge, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that there's a strong case. So this obsession with archaic astronomy obviously had the practical purpose with its bit of expansion because of predicting the floods. I keep repeating that, but it's important, so it's worth repeating. And naturally, these people would not want to extend the benefits of their knowledge, because that would allow other people to, first of all, claim the same benefits and to accumulate wealth, but second of all, it would simply destroy their position in society, because it would make themselves useless if everybody had their knowledge. Gee, what is that a modern corollary of? Can you think of anything, Nima, where if we just had the same knowledge of that people keep in secret, that the social situation might be a little bit different?
Yeah, like the history of all civilizations,
or the history of money, or how. Yeah, right.
Money, banking.
Anyway,
media.
So, what happened was more and more wealth started getting concentrated in fewer and fewer people, and eventually these priests had nothing productive left to spend this stuff on, and obviously started spending it on non-productive things and on themselves. So by the third millennium, expansion begins to slow down, and by roughly 2500 BC, has begun to close, which is going to lead us into our fourth stage, conflict. So, quickly puts the dates at conflict from roughly 2700 to 700 BC, and I think it's important to point out the overlap here, because we said expansion ended in 2500, but the conflict starts in 2700. These things don't just stop and start like with a light switch. You know, they kind of grow, and there can be signs of both at the same time. And so that's what I think was happening between 2700 and 2500 BC. So the definition of the Age of Conflict is it's the date at which the rate of expansion begins to decline until the period in which one political unit conquers the entire civilization. And so the signs of this are, as I just said, decreasing rate of expansion, imperialist wars, class conflicts, and irrationality. So the slowing rate of expansion in Mesopotamian civilization is obvious from the slowing rate of its invention. So we just spent all that time talking about inventions for the Age of Expansion, which occurred from 4700 to 2700 BC. And in the same amount of time, 2,000 years from 2700 to 700 BC, we only know of two things that were actually invented, which were this positional notation that we talked about in 2100 BC, and the Assyrians apparently invented aqueducts around 700 BC.
Well, also, I think it's important to add that there was a period known as the Dark Ages, the first Dark Ages, I think, that also falls within that time frame.
Yep, and that video that
I believe it was around 1200 BC or so.
That Eric Klein video I talked about, when I brought up the importance of tin, the video is actually on that Dark Age. I recommend checking it out. Way cool.
I might have watched that one actually then, because I watched somebody talking about that same stuff too a while ago.
I actually probably sent it to you.
No, I found it myself.
Let's fight about it. Okay. So, obviously, particularly when we're looking at these ancient societies, and there's only so much evidence that we can dig out of the ground, the imperialist wars are going to be the most obvious thing to look at. So, by the latter half of the third millennium, war became the dominant activity of society, where the secular leaders of the military, i.e. the kings, Gilgamesh, gained enough power to dominate the priesthood, and through this transition, war became, according to Quigley, in the minds of many people, the only way to supply adequate slaves and metals to make up for the slowing of economic progress. Again, why does that sound familiar? The chief aim for control was over the Syrian saddle. And if you remember from part 3, the Syrian saddle is this place where the Mediterranean Ocean at sea is closest to the Euphrates River, because when you're crossing from east to west over modern day Syria, up to the north you got the mountains of Anatolia, and to the south you have the Arabian Desert, and in ancient times this is like the one little spot that you can actually cross on foot. And so obviously whoever controlled this area controlled all of the trade that happened on it. You can demand taxes, and you can also control the trade, like I just mentioned. And apparently the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mesopotamians all fought for control over this area. And Quigley makes an important point, because he says whoever was in charge of Mesopotamia fought with the Egyptians and the Hittites over this area. Because as these imperialist wars went on, we get like this row of growing universal empires that in succession that conquered larger and larger parts of Mesopotamia. So the first ones were the Akkadians in 2200 BC, which were followed by the Babylonians, whose most famous ruler was Hammurabi, who ruled from 1728 to 1686 BC. This empire was broken up by the Kassites, who were pastoral flatland invaders. I guess think something like the Mongols or the Huns. And fighting for the core area of the civilization resumed. And it wasn't until the Iron Age that the Assyrians arrived on the scene that we could really say that Mesopotamia enters stage 5, which is the stage of universal empire. So
I just want to add something real quick, and that is the fact that the age of expansion, the age of conflict, also happened to overlap with the first monetary system that we have observed and documented in history, which was a fiat money system, as we've discussed before.
That is an interesting point.
Starting about 3500 BC, which is right into the age of expansion, and ending around 700 BC, which is when the age of conflict ends.
I'm pausing because I'm thinking. I never thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that because they need an instrument of expansion during the expansionary phase, so they invented them, or they put in place a monetary system, or somebody gave it to them and they revived it or whatever, or somebody gave them the knowledge about it and they implemented it, and that went all the way to 700 BC, and that's when the axial age, as Graeber calls it, begins, which was a more gold and silver based monetary system. Also,
and
first time coins were struck, I believe.
It was the first time what?
Yes. The Greeks, I think they struck silver coins for the first time in around 800 or 700 BC in Lydia.
Well, and then the axial age, as I remember David Graeber describing it, was one where human life really achieved its lowest market value it ever had. I mean,
well, yeah, it was the age of universal warfare.
Well, and I mean, if you really want to learn about this, I mentioned Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. He did one recently called Paintertainment, where he goes over the history of torture, and the drama that we get about torture. Because for us, we often think about the executioners of medieval Europe, and how people would be drawn and quartered, and the horror and evil of how long it would take to kill somebody and just torture them as much as they possibly could. That they had that on a factory line in ancient Rome during the axial age. The Colosseum, he points out that during lunch, after you threw the lions and the soldiers together and had everybody died and everyone takes a break for lunch, that some people might come back from lunch early and you got to have something to entertain them. So that's when they pulled out the prisoners that they were going to torture to death. And if you were lucky and you got back early, you could sit and you can call out something to the torturer. Say rip his balls off, and he might actually rip the guy's balls off. So you could participate in the torture from the. I mean, it's what am I hearing? And part of the Roman conquest was capturing.
Well, it kind of reminds me of Monty Python's Life of Brian, where they all want to participate in the stoning.
Yeah,
because it's.
Well, they were in the Colosseum there too. Fun. Did they say? I can't remember. Did they say anything at the Colosseum?
Well, yeah, the Colosseum. They have some Colosseum scenes too. There's one person picking up limbs and stuff.
Oh yes.
And then they have this gladiator fighting some guy. Gladiator fighting some guy who's condemned to death. The guy just runs away from him, and the gladiator gets a cardiac arrest.
Oh yes, I do remember that now. But what I wanted to point out, because I'm going to get back to the Assyrians here, and I'm going to read you an Assyrian inscription. Nima pointed out the beginning of the axial age. We could really start pointing at about 800 BC. So. And I pointed out the paintertainment to give you an idea of how awful things used to be. Things used to be really, really bad. And to the point where, like I said, the Romans had this factory line of torture, and it was just a thing that you brought your kid to, like a football game. And part of their conquest was capturing slaves to send back, not to just the Colosseum, but they built Colosseums all over the place to feed these Colosseums to torture people so they could be watched. And if you think that's just a Roman thing, as Dan Carlin points out, wherever the Romans built these places, the locals loved it. I'm glad I didn't live back then. So the Assyrians, they emerged from a hill country north of the river valley in the 9th century BC. The pattern of the Universal Empire is that the conquering political unit always emerges from the periphery. This is the periphery of Mesopotamian civilization. So they were ruthlessly militaristic and so proud of it that they were famous for the gory descriptions, of which I'm going to read you one, which is an inscription by Ashur-nasir-pal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC. Quote, I stormed the mountain peaks and took them. In the midst of the mighty mountain I slaughtered them, and with their blood dyed the mountain red like wool. I carried off their spoil and their possessions. The heads of their warriors I cut off, and I formed them into a pillar over their city. Their young men and maidens I burned in the fire, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up within the pillar. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. Many within the border of my own land I flayed, and I spread their skins upon the walls, and I cut off the limbs of the royal officers who had rebelled.
Wow, he needs a therapist.
Yeah, apparently all the Assyrian rulers were like this. They all had inscriptions like this. And, I mean, to be so proud of something like that, man. Whoa. I mean, to compare it to a modern example, you hear about what ISIS is doing to people in Syria. And with our modern minds, we understand, I mean, I think we rightfully understand how awful it is. But you, like, read ancient history, and it's just, like, part and parcel. Ugh. Just standard operating procedure. And to contrast this inscription, that we're still in Mesopotamia on, that the Assyrians wrote, to the collecting of taxes to predict floods and build irrigation systems by the Sumerian Priesthood of the Age of Expansion. Slight difference in the civilization. So, now, even the Assyrians were eventually conquered by Chaldea in 612 BC, who were then finally conquered by the final Mesopotamian Universal Empire, which was Persia, in 538 BC. So, stages 6 and 7 are going to be pretty quicker, because there's not a whole lot to say about stage 6, other than it really sucked and nobody gave a shit until someone invaded them and they died. So, at 538 BC, we're a mere 200 years away from the invasion of Alexander the Great in 333 BC, which ends Mesopotamian civilization forever. These are the invaders. So Mesopotamian civilization has a very short age of decay, especially when compared with its neighbor civilization, Egyptian, which Quigley argues stayed in this stage for about 650 years, and the argument being that Egypt was a little more secluded, where Mesopotamia was really this crossroads of, 3 or 4 different continents, if we're calling India its own continent. And it was in a very exposed position, so that's why you see this succession of universal empires. And what's also interesting is that Egypt fell to Alexander the Great without a token of resistance, and Mesopotamia was able to put up a decent fight. And Quigley's reason for this is that, again, it has to do with instruments and institutions, is every time a new empire invaded Mesopotamia, you would get a new instrument of government. And by the time it became an institution of government, you would get another empire that invaded it with a new instrument. So there was a little bit of life left in the system by the time Alexander the Great came to resist him. Although not enough, because, like everybody knows, it was destroyed, and Mesopotamian civilization ends forever. So, and that being stage 7. Remember, 6 is decay, 7 is invasion. So, thus we could see that Mesopotamian civilization follows Quigley's 7 stages, like, almost to their definition. I think the only minor distortion being this succession of universal empires. So that's the end of what I got here, Nima. Is there anything you wanted to add before we finish this up?
We've now been talking for an hour and 40 minutes, so I
Probably not.
think we've covered it all.
Okay, yeah, this was a long one. It was going to be shorter until I watched all that stuff about the stuff that happened about the cataclysmic event and the flood and the ice age, and I threw in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So I apologize if this one's long. I know Nima wants to get to bed. So in our next episode, we're going to be covering the offspring of Mesopotamian civilization, which is going to be Minoan and Canaanite civilization. So stay tuned. And with that, this is Amagi with your co-hosts Dylan Moore, that's me, of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com, and we will be seeing you next week. Thank you so much for listening.